The sky over Willow Creek Cemetery churned with heavy gray clouds. The kind Gideon used to call builder's weather, because they promised work delays and mud. I stood by his casket as the minister's words blurred into the static of my grief. At 65, I had prepared myself for the possibility of widowhood, but nothing could steady me for the sudden silence left by the man who had built our lives. Brick by brick, Celeste stood at the head of the coffin, her black silk dress falling perfectly in place, her tears arranged as carefully as her makeup. Damian Reed, her fiancé, hovered at her shoulder, whispering consolations loud enough for half the mourners to hear. I should have felt pity. But her performance left me hollow. She looked less like a grieving daughter than an actress auditioning for sympathy. Then her voice rose above the hush. "Father left everything to me, just as he promised," she declared, pressing one manicured hand against the casket. A few gasps slipped through the crowd. My fingers clenched around Gideon's old photograph in my purse. "You'll never be without a roof. Mariella," he had told me when he drafted his estate papers. Hearing Celeste twist his promise into ownership stabbed me with suspicion. Damian leaned closer to a banker in attendance and, in his eagerness, spoke too freely. With the Zurich account secured, "We'll have international flexibility?" The words struck me cold. Gideon had never once mentioned Zurich to me. But if such an account existed, Damian had no business knowing about it. As the last shovelfuls of earth landed on Gideon's coffin, Celeste glided toward me, her eyes like polished glass. She placed a hand on my arm with a smile sharp enough to cut. "You're no longer welcome in the house," she whispered. "Go die somewhere else." By nightfall, the locks on the Ortega mansion had been changed. I walked away carrying 2 worn suitcases and Gideon's leather ledger pressed to my chest, the last piece of him that felt like mine. The roses he planted decades ago clung to the fence as I left, their petals trembling in the rising wind, as though they too understood a storm had only just begun. The hum of the neon sign outside my window flickered in uneven rhythm, painting the walls of the motel room with a sickly pink glow. The air smelled of bleach and stale smoke, but I hardly noticed. I sat on the sagging mattress, Gideon's leather ledger open on my lap, replaying Celeste's words again and again. "Go die somewhere else." I traced the familiar handwriting in the margins of the ledger, my husband's neat block letters calming me even as the echo of his absence hollowed me out. Months ago, he had shown me a draft of his trust, buried among the clauses. My eye had snagged on a strange phrase, Matriarch Advisor C Covenant Paragraph 12. I had laughed at the time, asking what on earth it meant. Gideon had only smiled and pressed my hand. "If Celeste forgets who she is, you'll know what to do." Now those words pulsed in my memory, heavy with meaning I had failed to grasp. Was that clause still there? Or had Celeste and Damian arranged for it to be erased? And what of Damian's careless boast at the funeral? The Zurich account, if such a thing existed, it wasn't meant to be his to flaunt. I poured a cup of watery motel coffee from the small machine by the sink, its bitterness grounding me. I promised myself I would not return to Celeste's doorstep to beg. Gideon had prepared for something, and I would honor him by uncovering it. My thoughts drifted to those final days in hospice. Gideon's body frail, but his grip on my hand still firm. "Promise me you'll outthink anyone who tries to erase you," he whispered. I had nodded, choking back tears, not knowing that promise would be called in so soon. I flipped the ledger to a blank page and began a list. Find the lawyer. Find Covenant Paragraph 12. Investigate Damian Reed. 3 steps, clear as any ledger entry. My heart steadied with the rhythm of resolve. And as the coffee cooled at my side, I knew the fight had only begun. 3 days passed in the dim glow of the motel's buzzing neon. I had grown accustomed to the drone of 18-wheelers barreling down Interstate 35, to the bitter taste of the coffee that dripped from the machine, to the hollow quiet of a room that smelled like someone else's mistakes. I was scribbling notes in Gideon's ledger when the motel phone rang. Shrill and unexpected. Mama Celeste's voice cracked through the line, pitched with panic. They froze the accounts. The bank won't let me move more than $50,000. Damien says the condo deal is falling apart. They said we need a second signature, something about a matriarch advisor. What did you do? I sat straighter. I didn't do anything. Celeste, your father wrote those rules. He wanted safeguards. You're lying, she spat, the desperation undercutting her anger. You're sabotaging me. A new voice pushed onto the line, sharp and controlled. Damien, listen, old woman. Sign the papers, or I'll make sure you never see a penny from this family again. Don't test me. I let the silence stretch, then pressed the receiver back into its cradle. My hands trembled, but not with fear. Only recognition. Gideon had indeed hidden something in plain sight. I reached for my phone and dialed the number of Aisha Patel, the estate attorney. Her calm voice answered on the second ring. I told her everything: the frozen accounts, the signature requirement, Damien's threat. There was no hesitation on her end. Your husband created a matriarch advisor clause for 12 months. No disbursement over $50,000 can be made without your countersignature, and if there's evidence of coercion or estrangement, the entire inheritance can be frozen permanently. The word estrangement stung. My daughter had cast me out with cruelty. By law, that might already count. I closed the ledger slowly, feeling Gideon's handwriting press against my palm. The house, the millions, the control Celeste thought she owned it could all be slipping from her grasp. And she didn't even know it yet. Aisha Patel's office smelled faintly of lemon polish and old leather, the scent of order and permanence. I sat across from her at a broad oak desk, my hands folded tightly over Gideon's ledger. Framed certificates lined the wall behind her, and family photographs softened the severity of the room. It felt like a place where truths were spoken plainly, where paperwork carried the weight of law. Aisha slid a document across the desk toward me. Her finger tapped a section highlighted in yellow ink. Here it is. Mrs. Ortega Legacy Covenant. Section 12. I leaned forward, reading the words with care. Any act of humiliation, eviction, or coercion toward the matriarch advisor shall result in an immediate halt to trust disbursements. If such acts are sustained, the entirety of assets shall be redirected to the Ortega Legacy Fund, supporting single mothers entering skilled trades. The words blurred for a moment as my throat tightened. Gideon had seen this coming. He had foreseen Celeste's weakness, her pride, her blindness to the cost of greed. He hadn't left me defenseless. Instead, he had built a wall of legal stone around me. Still, the knowledge cut deep. I had carried Celeste inside me, raised her with care, sacrificed to give her every chance at life. Now I was protected from her. The contradiction stung worse than Damien's threats. Aisha's voice broke into my thoughts. Be prepared. Damien won't stop. He'll push harder, maybe in ways you don't expect. And Celeste, she may never forgive you for standing in her way. I nodded, the truth settling heavily in my chest. Forgiveness might be too much to hope for, but survival, I could secure that. Gideon had made certain of it. Aisha copied the clause, stamped it with her seal, and slid it into a folder for me. I left her office with the papers tucked against my chest, feeling both vindicated and afraid. Outside, the Texas sun glared against the pavement, harsh and unyielding, as though it too demanded I be ready for what would come next. The public library's archives smelled of dust and yellowed newsprint, a scent that clung to my clothes long after I left. I sat beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights, scrolling through court filings on a sluggish computer. Damian Reed's name surfaced again and again, tied to lawsuits over failed investment retreats in Nevada. Each case ended in quiet settlements or dismissals that reeked of money changing hands. Further digging revealed sealed bankruptcies, assets shifted into shell companies, then dissolved before investigators could seize them. The pattern was obvious. Create a scheme, lure investors, strip the money, disappear. I scribbled notes in Gideon's ledger, my pen pressing grooves into the paper. The man wasn't careless, he was practiced. Back at the motel, I compared my notes to Gideon's margins. One entry stopped me cold. Reed pitched me on a capital infusion. Declined. Gideon had seen Damian's hunger years ago and turned him away. That refusal must have festered until Damian found another route through Celeste. The realization burned in my chest. Damian hadn't chosen my daughter for love. He had chosen her as a vault he could crack. Late that night, Aisha called. Her voice carried the kind of steadiness that only came with bad news. Mara, my investigator, found something. Early drafts of a transfer document Damian forged Celeste's signature, trying to funnel trust money into an LLC that exists only on paper. I gripped the motel desk so hard the laminate groaned. My daughter's name, her very identity, had been stolen before her eyes, and she was too blinded by devotion to see it. I opened my notebook and wrote in heavy strokes, "My daughter is blind, but am I strong enough to tear off her blindfold?" The words stared back at me. Harsh as truth. I capped my pen, closed the ledger, and felt the motel walls press in. Damian had built his life on shadows. If I didn't act soon, Celeste would be swallowed by them. The roses Gideon planted decades ago curled around the porch railings as I walked up the steps of the house that was once ours. Their scent struck me like a memory, bittersweet and stubborn. Inside, the mansion glowed with too much light, every chandelier blazing as if Celeste wanted to prove the house was alive without him. The dining table stretched long and formal, set with china I hadn't seen since our anniversary parties. Celeste sat at the head, her shoulders drawn tight beneath a silk blouse. Damian lounged beside her, all polished confidence. I took the chair opposite, placing Gideon's ledger on the table as though it were a silent witness. Celeste's voice wavered before the food was even served. "Mama, please, just sign the authorization. The bank won't release more than scraps. Damian needs the liquidity for the condo deal." Damian leaned forward, eyes hard. 10 million, straight into my venture fund. It's all structured, perfectly legal. You just need to stop dragging your heels. I folded my hands, steadying my voice. There will be no release unless conditions are met. Therapy for you. Celeste, a waiver protecting the inheritance from spouses or fiancés, and the immediate activation of the legacy fund your father established. Damian barked a laugh. "You're just a guest here. Don't mistake sentiment for authority." I met his gaze without blinking. Covenant Section 12. Clause 4. Any intimidation of the matriarch advisor is defined as coercion. That alone is grounds to divert the inheritance to charity. Permanently, the words landed like a strike. Damian's jaw tightened. His glass slammed against the table, red wine bleeding across the white cloth. Celeste burst into tears. Caught between his fury and the terror of losing everything, I rose slowly, collecting Gideon's ledger. "The more you press, the less you'll have," I said, letting the truth settle in the silence. The roses outside trembled in the wind as I stepped into the night, their thorns a reminder that beauty could defend itself, and that I would too. The storm rolled in just after dusk, rattling the motel windows as rain streaked down the glass in crooked lines. I set Gideon's ledger on the nightstand and pulled the battered suitcase onto the bed. Beneath the clothes and papers lay the quilt Gideon had given me on our 20th anniversary. Its stitches worn but intact. I hadn't unfolded it since the funeral. Tonight, the thunder pushed me to reach for it. The patterns had always struck me as peculiar. Uneven triangles scattered among more traditional squares. I traced them now with my fingers, remembering his voice the night he draped it over my shoulders. Our futures in the seams. Mara, don't forget that. I had laughed at the time, thinking it a sweet, cryptic gesture, but as lightning lit the room, I noticed the embroidery wasn't random. Letters, almost hidden, zigzagged through the fabric. I spread the quilt across the bed, following the lines with the careful eye I'd honed over decades of bookkeeping. 10 words emerged. Fragmented but familiar half of a crypto wallet seed phrase. My breath caught. Gideon, the man who built houses with calloused hands, had also built a vault of numbers and code. I opened the ledger, flipping to the page where he had listed birthdays mine, Celeste's, his mother's, even our old dog's. Dates aligned with gaps in the quilt's phrase. The other half of the code was locked in memories only I carried. Together, they formed the key. I pressed the quilt to my chest, tears mingling with the scent of cedar that still clung to the fabric. Gideon had trusted me above anyone else, not with sentiment, but with the safeguard of his life's work. Without me, no one, not Celeste, not Damien, could unlock the emergency liquidity that secured the trust. The storm outside roared, but inside I felt steady. Gideon's foresight was not just love, it was armor. I folded the quilt carefully, sliding it back into the suitcase, and wiped my eyes. Tomorrow, I would face whatever Damien had planned, armed with more than memories. The next afternoon, I sat in Aisha's office as her investigator slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were photographs and transcripts from an upscale restaurant in downtown Dallas. Damien, dressed in his finest suit, leaned close to a realtor over an expensive bottle of wine. The recording caught his voice clearly, arranging to backdate property offers and funnel funds through layered accounts. It was wire fraud in plain sight. The investigator's notes detailed every step, the forged timelines, the shell companies, the promises of invisible returns. Damien's greed wasn't just reckless, it was criminal. I felt both fury and a grim satisfaction. At last, we had proof strong enough to pierce Celeste's blindness. That evening, I drove to the mansion, the folder heavy in my bag. Celeste met me in the foyer, her eyes red from sleepless nights. I spread the documents across the mahogany table. Read them, I said softly. This is what Damien is doing behind your back. She skimmed the pages, shaking her head. No, he wouldn't. Damien loves me. This is some trick of yours. Before I could answer, the front door slammed. Damien strode in, his anger raw. He saw the papers and went pale, then snarled at me. You think you can turn her against me? Celeste's voice wavered. Tell me it isn't true. His composure cracked. You think I'd waste 2 years grooming you for nothing? The words echoed like gunfire in the vaulted room. Celeste's face drained of color, her world collapsing in an instant. Aisha stepped from the shadows of the hall, calm and steady. We'll be turning this over to the district attorney. For the first time, Damien looked afraid. He backed toward the door, spitting curses, and fled into the night. Celeste stood frozen, hands trembling over the scattered papers. I reached out, but she pulled away, her gaze lost somewhere I couldn't follow. The mansion felt colder than ever, though the proof of Damien's betrayal still lay between us. Undeniable. The conference room smelled faintly of fresh ink and polished wood, the kind of place where truths are put on paper and sealed with signatures. I sat at one end of the long table, Gideon's ledger resting beside my folder of documents. Across from me, Celeste twisted a tissue in her hands, her eyes swollen from days of tears. Aisha presided quietly between us, her calm presence anchoring the storm. I spoke slowly, each condition clear and deliberate. First, Damien is out permanently. No contact, no influence. Second, a court-filed prenup waiver, ensuring no spouse or fiancé can lay claim to these funds. Third, all spending will follow a capped plan, every major disbursement requiring my countersignature. And fourth, before anything else, the legacy fund your father created must be established and funded. Celeste flinched at each line, but she didn't argue. She only stared at the papers before her, as if hoping the ink would blur into something easier. When Aisha slid the documents across, Celeste's hand trembled as she reached for the pen. The sound of her signature scratching across the page was thin but final. She dropped the pen and pressed her face into her hands. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered, the words muffled but unmistakable. My chest tightened with a mixture of grief and relief. I rose and walked to her side. For a moment, she leaned into my arms, sobbing like the little girl who once ran to me after nightmares. I held her, but I did not promise everything would return to what it was. Love, I realized, wasn't about blind sacrifice. It needed boundaries, or it twisted into something unrecognizable. When the papers were gathered and sealed, I chose my path with quiet certainty. I would not move back into the mansion. Instead, I rented a modest apartment a few blocks from the old house, a place with space enough for me and Gideon's quilt. Independence was my anchor now, and boundaries my shield. The sun dipped low as I carried the signed agreements home, ready for the final reckoning that still awaited us both. Sunday sunlight streamed across the Ortega mansion's porch as neighbors gathered in the garden, their voices carrying a note of celebration rather than mourning. The first scholarships from the Legacy Fund had just been awarded. Young mothers in hard hats stood proudly with certificates, ready to train in the trades Gideon once mastered. Applause rippled through the crowd, not just for them, but for Gideon's foresight, for the legacy he had left in something stronger than stone. I stood near the roses, their blossoms still clinging stubbornly to the vines Gideon had planted, watching those women receive their chance. I felt a swell of pride. This was the kind of wealth Gideon always valued. Opportunity handed forward. Celeste moved quietly among the guests, no longer the polished hostess, but a volunteer setting out chairs, pouring water, listening instead of commanding. Each week she returned to the fund, working side by side with the women it supported. I saw humility growing in her gestures, the slow work of change taking root. Later, after the guests left, she invited me to stay for caldo. We ate at the long table, just the two of us, the silence gentler than it had been in months. When the bowls were cleared, I stood to go, knowing my small apartment waited for me. Celeste disappeared into the hall and returned with a tiny brass keyring. She placed it in my hand. "This isn't charity, Mama," she said, her voice steady. "It's respect. I want you to have a choice." I closed my fingers over the keys, meeting her gaze. "Good," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Then we're finally rich in the right way. Driving back to my apartment, the quilt folded neatly on my bed came to mind. Gideon's last promise echoed there, clear as ever. "You'll never be without a roof." He had been right. My shelter wasn't the mansion's bricks or the millions in accounts. It was the dignity of standing tall, the strength of boundaries, and the fragile but living hope that respect could rebuild what greed once shattered.